Welcome back to Poirot Files. Today we're diving into an intriguing mystery, Hercule Poirot and the widow who saw her husband after his funeral, a tale of deception, secrets, and Poirot's brilliant investigative mind. But before that, I want to say you've shown me so much love and I truly appreciate it. Let us know where you're tuning in from. Grab your coffee and let's get started. Chapter 1. The Unsettling Death. The invitation came to me at the tail end of a particularly dreary afternoon, when the fog had settled thick over London, and the streets seemed as if they were drowning beneath its weight. The letter, embossed with the Hadley family crest, arrived with an air of finality. The wax seal was a deep crimson, a faint imprint of a lion's head, and the handwriting was elegant, almost too delicate for the hand of a widow. Hercule Poirot, it read, I require your assistance in a matter most unusual, one which I trust only your expertise can solve. A private dinner has been arranged at my estate in Devon, where I wish to speak to you of a troubling matter involving my late husband, Gregory Hadley. The note was signed, simply, Mrs. Veronica Hadley. It was unlike anything I had ever received. There was a faint sense of desperation beneath her words, a kind of quiet insistence. The widow of a man recently deceased, Gregory Hadley had died 2 weeks ago, was asking for my help, but the request itself suggested that she needed more than just a typical inquiry. There was something peculiar about the tone. I had not thought much of it until my arrival at the Hadley estate the following evening. The journey had taken me hours, and by the time I reached the sprawling manor tucked away in the heart of the English countryside, the fog seemed to have swallowed the world whole. The grounds, still lavish despite their air of neglect, had a dismal, almost mournful feel to them. A tall, imposing gate opened silently before my driver, and we made our way up the winding gravel driveway. As we neared the mansion, its grey stone facade loomed in the mist, as if it were watching us approach. I noticed that the front door was ajar, as if the house itself were eager to welcome, or perhaps even to trap me inside. Mrs. Hadley met me in the grand entry hall, a long, opulent space with tall windows that looked out over the estate's extensive gardens. She was a striking woman in her late 40s, her features still sharp and graceful, but there was something undeniably fragile about her. A delicate pallor to her skin, a nervous flutter in her eyes. "Poirot," she said, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "Thank you for coming. You are as precise as they said you would be. I had hoped to speak to you privately about a matter no one else will believe." I bowed my head in acknowledgement, my mind already processing her every word, her every movement. She led me through the hall and we entered a small, dimly lit drawing room. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows that danced across the walls like ghosts. "Please," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "This is difficult for me to explain." I settled into the chair opposite her, keeping my posture straight and my mind focused. "Mademoiselle Hadley," I said, addressing her with the formality I reserve for all those in distress, "tell me of this matter, and let us see what we may discover together." She hesitated, the weight of her thoughts pressing against her. Finally, she spoke. "My husband, Gregory, my late husband, appeared to me after his funeral." I leaned forward slightly, allowing my expression to remain neutral, my fingers steepled in thought. "Appeared, you say? In what manner?" Mrs. Hadley clasped her hands tightly, her knuckles white. "I was alone in the drawing-room, just as I am now, when I saw him standing in the doorway. At first, I thought I was dreaming, perhaps the strain of the funeral, the shock, but no, he was there. I could see him clearly, his face, his posture, the suit he was buried in. Everything. Mon Dieu, I muttered, more to myself than to her. And did he speak? She shook her head quickly. No, but his presence. It was overwhelming. And then, just as quickly as he appeared, he vanished, like smoke. I studied her carefully. There was no exaggeration in her voice, no sign of outright hysteria. Instead, she spoke with an almost clinical detachment, as though her own words were foreign to her. She was clearly troubled, but I could sense that there was more to the story than mere ghostly apparitions. You believe this to be an apparition? I asked, my voice even curious. I do, she said, her gaze unwavering. But, Poirot, my mind tells me it must be something else, something more. My husband's death was deemed natural, a heart attack. But his appearance, it was
not a dream. It was too real. I allowed a brief silence to stretch between us, letting her words hang in the air.
My mind sifted through the possibilities. Was this a matter of grief clouding her judgment, or was there some darker secret hidden beneath the surface? And you are certain, I said carefully, that there was no possibility of someone, perhaps a visitor or a servant, impersonating him? She met my gaze with a sharpness that surprised me. Of course not, I would have known. No, Poirot, it was Gregory. But he is dead. I know that. I buried him myself. Yet he was standing in front of me, as alive as you are now. The room seemed to grow colder, and I could feel the weight of the mystery pressing down upon us both. It was as if the very air
itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next twist in this bizarre tale. You have reason to believe someone else may be involved?
I asked, watching her closely for any sign of change in her demeanor. Her lips parted, but before she could respond, a faint sound echoed from outside the room, a subtle, almost imperceptible shuffle of footsteps. Mrs. Hadley stiffened, her eyes flicking nervously toward the door. I caught the faintest hint of tension in her posture. "A servant?" I asked. "No," she replied in a voice barely above a whisper. "It's nothing." But the flicker of fear in her eyes told me otherwise. As the fire crackled, I leaned back in my chair, considering the case before me. The widow's story was strange, and there were questions that lingered, questions about Gregory Hadley's sudden death, the widow's conflicting emotions, and the disturbing possibility that something far more sinister was at play. "I shall begin my investigation tomorrow," I said at last, my voice steady. "But for now, Mademoiselle Hadley, I will ask only one thing." "Yes," she whispered, almost afraid to speak. "Do not leave this house, or the mystery may be far more dangerous than you can imagine." With that, I stood and made my way to the door, my mind already whirring with possibilities, my little grey cells working overtime to uncover the truth. The first piece of the puzzle had been set into place, but the rest? That was still hidden in the fog. Chapter 2. A murder, most unlikely. The following morning arrived with a crispness to the air that seemed almost deliberate, sharp, clear, and strangely expectant. I awoke early, having spent a restless night, Edic's mind endlessly churning over the strange events Mrs. Hadley had recounted to me the evening before. The morning fog still hung heavily over the grounds of the Hadley estate, shrouding everything in an almost oppressive veil, as though the house itself were reluctant to share its secrets. Mrs. Hadley had retired early the night before, as one would expect from a widow still grieving the loss of her husband. Yet the story she had told of her husband's ghostly visitation gnawed at my thoughts. Could it be mere grief playing tricks on her mind, or was there truly something more sinister at play? I did not yet know, but one thing was certain. The case had already begun to weave itself into an intricate tapestry, and it was my job to follow the threads wherever they led. At breakfast, Mrs. Hadley was a different woman from the one I had encountered the evening before. There was a sharpness to her eyes, a hard edge to her smile that did not quite reach her lips. I suspected she had spent the night in deep thought, wrestling with the same doubts I harboured. She greeted me with a polite nod as I entered the dining room, but the air between us was heavy with unspoken words. "Poirot?" she said, once we had exchanged pleasantries. "I trust you slept well?" "Yes, Mademoiselle Hadley," I replied carefully, choosing my words. "A good night's sleep, though I find I am now eager to begin my investigation." She looked at me curiously, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "I understand. I only hope that you can find some explanation. I can hardly believe what I saw, but I know what I felt." "I shall do my best," I said, my voice calm and assured, even as my thoughts swirled with questions. I had no intention of entertaining the notion of ghosts, but I was curious, undeniably so, about the circumstances surrounding Gregory Hadley's death and the widow's cryptic behaviour. There were mysteries here that begged to be unravelled. Breakfast was a quiet affair, punctuated only by the occasional murmur of conversation, but the presence of the butler, Thompson, was enough to remind me of the servants who had been witness to the recent events. Their observations would be important. Perhaps one of them had noticed something amiss that Mrs. Hadley herself had not. After the meal, Mrs. Hadley led me to the study, a grand room filled with dark mahogany furniture, and an impressive collection of books, many of them on subjects ranging from philosophy to history. The shelves seemed to groan under the weight of knowledge, and yet the room held an air of discomfort. It was as though the books themselves were trying to hide something. "Here," Mrs. Hadley said, gesturing toward a small desk. "This is where I found the letter." I approached the desk, my sharp eyes scanning the clutter of papers that covered its surface. There, in the midst of the seemingly disorganized pile, lay a letter, its wax seal intact, though it appeared to have been opened with care. Mrs. Hadley handed it to me without a word, her eyes flicking nervously toward the door, as if expecting someone to enter uninvited. The letter was addressed in Gregory Hadley's familiar hand, the strokes of the pen bold and decisive. But it was not the words that intrigued me immediately. It was the date, 2 days before his death. A man preparing for his funeral had written this letter, and yet he had given no indication that anything was amiss in his final days. No word of sickness or trouble. The letter seemed perfectly ordinary, almost too ordinary. I began to read. "My dearest Veronica, I write this to you not because of any ailment that afflicts me, nor because I fear what is to come. It is simply because I need to say what has been left unsaid between us for so long. There are things I have kept to myself, secrets that have weighed heavily on my conscience. But there is one thing I must leave with you. I am sorry for the way things have turned out. If you ever learn the truth, you will understand why it could not have been any other way. I do hope in time you will find peace. With all my love, Gregory." I paused, the letter's contents swirling in my mind. What did he mean by the truth? What was he apologizing for? And why had he left such an enigmatic message, one that now seemed so painfully final? It was as if he had known something about his death, or perhaps something more about his relationship with his wife, that had driven him to write these words. I looked up at Mrs. Hadley, who was watching me closely, her expression a mixture of unease and resignation. "It's cryptic," I said finally, my voice low. "But it offers us a clue, does it not?" It speaks of a truth, something Gregory wished his wife to understand, something he may not have been able to tell her in life. Mrs. Hadley's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together. I don't know what it means. I never saw this letter until after the funeral. I found it among his papers when I was going through his things. It doesn't make sense.
Ah, I said slowly. But that, Mrs. Hadley, is where the mystery deepens. You see, a letter such as this suggests that Gregory Hadley may have known something about his impending death. Or perhaps it was not a natural death at all. Her eyes widened. You think? I shook my head, cutting off her question.
I do not yet know, but I intend to find out. The widow's gaze shifted to the window, her thoughts seemingly miles away. I could sense that she was grappling with her own fears, doubts, and perhaps a sense of guilt. Her husband's death was far from a simple matter, and the more I observed her, the more I began to believe that she knew more than she was willing to admit. But what was she hiding? And why had she brought me into this web of secrecy? I rose from the desk, my mind already working through the implications of the letter. If Gregory Hadley had known something about his death, then it was possible that the cause was not as straightforward as a heart attack. Could it have been murder? And if so, who stood to benefit from his death? I turned to Mrs. Hadley, who was still gazing out the window. I must speak with your servants, Mrs. Hadley. They may have seen something, heard something, that could shed light on this. Your husband's death and your claims of his visitation are not ordinary matters. You have brought me here for a reason. Let us find out what that reason is. She nodded slowly, her face drawn tight with a mixture of fear and determination. Very well. But please, Poirot, do be careful. There is something in this house. Something I cannot explain. With that, I stepped out of the study, my mind alive with possibilities. I was no closer to understanding the full truth, but I could feel it just beneath the surface. As I made my way to the servants' quarters, I could sense the subtle shift in the atmosphere around me, a change that spoke of hidden secrets, unspoken tensions, and the quiet threat of something more than mere ghost stories. As I approached the first of the servants, I couldn't help but feel that the answer was lurking just out of reach. Would the truth Gregory Hadley had hinted at come to light, or was it something darker still? The investigation had only just begun, but already I could see that the threads were beginning to unravel. Chapter 3. The Hadley Family. The day wore on, and the gloomy English countryside outside the Hadley estate showed no sign of clearing. The fog lingered, thick and heavy, casting the world in a pall of uncertainty that mirrored the tension within the house. Mrs. Hadley had given her reluctant approval for my investigation to continue, but the atmosphere within the walls of her home was heavy with unspoken words. I had not yet spoken to the servants, as I had planned. I felt the need to first examine the immediate family, those closest to Gregory Hadley. If there was any malice involved in his death, it would surely be revealed in their reactions, their demeanour. Charles Hadley, Gregory's younger brother, was the first of these relatives to receive my attention. I had heard little about him during our initial conversation, but Mrs. Hadley's passing reference to him, something about his distant nature, had left me curious. It was unusual, I thought, that a brother would remain so detached after the death of a sibling, especially one as prominent as Gregory. But perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps I had underestimated the depth of their relationship. I found Charles in a sitting room adjacent to the study. He sat by the fireplace, a book open, in his lap, though his eyes were fixed on the flames rather than the pages. A man of medium height, with sharp features and a dark, brooding air, Charles looked every bit the part of someone who had lived a life of quiet dissatisfaction. His dark suit, though perfectly tailored, seemed too sombre, even for a man in mourning, Mr.
Hadley, I began, and his eyes slowly rose to meet mine. There was a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze, irritation, perhaps, or boredom.
I am Hercule Poirot, and I wish to ask you a few questions regarding your late brother's death. He did not immediately respond, only gave a slight dismissive nod before setting the book aside. I suppose that's to be expected, he muttered, his voice low and rough as though unused to conversation. What would you like to know? I took a seat across from him, choosing my words carefully. Tell me, Mr. Hadley, what was your relationship with your brother Gregory? Charles's lips curled into a tight, humourless smile. We were brothers, in the most basic sense of the word. I didn't know him well, and I can't say I'm terribly upset by his passing. Not upset? I asked, my eyebrow raising slightly. But surely— No, he interrupted, his voice gaining a touch of venom. Gregory and I had no love lost between us. He was always the favoured one, the successful one. I was always left in his shadow, his fortune, his reputation. It
all belonged to him. I was nothing.
There was bitterness in his tone, the kind that came from years of unresolved resentment. But still I remained calm. And yet you came to his funeral. I presume you cared in some way? He stiffened at that. I went because it was expected.
Blood, you know, family, but it doesn't change anything. I studied him for a moment, considering his words.
He was evasive, certainly. But was it truly disdain that had driven him to speak in such harsh terms? Or was there something else? Mr. Hadley, I said, choosing my next words carefully, you must understand I am not interested in personal squabbles. What I am asking is whether you knew anything unusual about Gregory's health in the days leading up to his death. Was he troubled in any way? Charles paused, as if contemplating how best to answer. No, he seemed fine. He was business as usual, I suppose. I never saw anything that would suggest he was in danger, but then again, what do I know? We rarely spoke of such things. There it was again, the distance. Charles Hadley, despite his bitterness, was not one to volunteer information, but I felt something linger in his words, something unsaid. You were aware of the letter Gregory wrote to his wife, yes? I asked, allowing my voice to become slightly more insistent. His expression faltered for just a moment, a brief, imperceptible shift, before his mask returned. I don't see how that's relevant, he said flatly. Gregory wrote a lot of letters. I hardly think one of them matters. Indeed? I said, making a mental note. Thank you for your time, Mr. Hadley. I may have further questions for you later. With that, I took my leave, but as I stepped out of the sitting room, I couldn't shake the feeling that Charles had been less than forthcoming. His words, his reactions, they were like a jigsaw puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit together. I would need to return to him. Of that I was certain. Next, I was introduced to Clara Hadley, Gregory's niece. I had heard little of her, aside from the fact that she had been very close to her uncle, particularly in his final years. She was a young woman in her mid-20s with an anxious demeanour and a soft, almost fragile appearance. The way she held herself, constantly shifting in her seat, her eyes darting nervously from side to side, suggested a woman on the edge of something. Perhaps it was grief, or perhaps it was something else. She was waiting for me in the drawing room, sitting by a window that overlooked the garden. The low light of the afternoon cast soft shadows across her face, making her look both ethereal and lost. When I entered, she looked up quickly, as if startled, and then gave me a weak smile. "Mr. Poirot," she said softly, her voice almost too quiet to hear. I didn't expect you so soon." "Miss Hadley, it is a pleasure," I replied, seating myself across from her. "I trust you are well?" She nodded, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her composure. "Yes, I am. Managing, thank you." I studied her for a moment before speaking. "I understand you were very close to your Uncle Gregory. Tell me, did you notice anything unusual about him in the days leading up to his death?" Her eyes flickered nervously as she answered. "No, nothing at all. He seemed perfectly fine. He was always so strong, so certain of himself. It wasn't until... She trailed off, her gaze dropping to her hands in her lap. "Until his death?" I prompted.
Gently, she nodded again, but something about her demeanor shifted.
There was an unease in her, a quiet desperation to avoid something. "Yes, it was all so sudden. I don't understand now. Everything seemed normal, and then—" She stopped herself, her breath catching in her throat. I leaned forward slightly, my voice soft but insistent. "Clara, if there is something you know, something you can tell me, it may help in the investigation." She met my eyes then, her expression one of palpable discomfort. She hesitated before speaking. I'm not sure how to say this, Mr. Poirot, but I overheard a conversation between my uncle and my aunt just a few days before his death. They were arguing about something to do with the will. It was so heated. I don't know what it was about, but it sounded serious. After that, Uncle Gregory seemed different. He wasn't himself. I leaned back, absorbing her words. The will. It was always about the will, wasn't it? And yet, Clara's discomfort, her reluctance to speak further, was enough to tell me that this was not a simple disagreement. There was something she was not telling me, something she feared. "I see," I said quietly, studying her face. "Thank you, Miss Hadley. I shall need to speak with your aunt about this. But I am certain that whatever you overheard is important." As I left her in the drawing room, I couldn't shake the growing sense that something far more sinister than a simple family dispute was at play here. The thread I had just tugged on had revealed more than I had anticipated. The investigation was beginning to take shape, slowly, cautiously, like a puzzle whose pieces were scattered across the estate, waiting to be fitted together. But I had no doubt that the pieces were there. The question, as always, was whether I could find them before it was too late. Chapter 4. Mrs. Hadley's account. The day had slipped by unnoticed, and as the evening shadows stretched long across the Hadley estate, I found myself once again facing Mrs. Hadley in the drawing-room. There was an odd sense of foreboding in the air, as though the very walls of the house were listening, waiting. I had gathered enough from my interviews with Charles and Clara to suspect that not all was as it seemed in this family, but Mrs. Hadley, she was the key. The widow, the grieving woman, and yet something about her story didn't sit right with me. Her earlier claims about seeing her husband's ghost had gnawed at me all day. Such things were never as simple as they seemed. When I entered, she was sitting by the window, staring out into the garden. Her expression was one of deep thought, her eyes lost in the distance. When she heard my approach, she turned slowly, her eyes betraying a fleeting glimpse of wariness before she masked it with a fragile smile. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," she said softly, her voice hoarse, as though she had been crying for hours. "I trust you are finding the estate comfortable?" "Very much so, madame," I replied, my tone measured. but I fear I have more questions for you. It is in your best interest that I understand everything clearly. Please forgive me for pressing, but I must know the truth." Her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, trembled slightly. "The truth, Monsieur Poirot?" "What truth do you seek?" she asked, her gaze not quite meeting mine. I studied her carefully, noting the way her eyes flitted to the side, avoiding direct contact. "Earlier you mentioned that you saw your husband in the garden late last night after the funeral. That is an unusual claim, n'est-ce pas? A man who has just passed away to be seen walking in the garden at such a late hour." Mrs. Hadley's face froze for an instant, her lips parting slightly, as if she had not expected me to press so directly. But it was the pause that intrigued me more than her response. She was calculating her words, I could tell. The widow was hiding something. It was not him, I suppose, she said, her voice unsteady. But it looked like him. It was so strange, Monsieur Poirot. I thought I was imagining things, but I was certain. He was standing by the rose bushes, just staring at the moon. Standing?
"And what did you do when you saw him?" I asked, leaning forward slightly, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I called out to him, but he didn't answer. He just stood there, unmoving, as if he hadn't heard me. I ran to
him, but when I reached the spot, he was gone. There was nothing there but the moonlight and the shadows. She trailed off, as though the memory was too much for her to bear. I allowed a long moment of silence to pass, giving her space to collect herself. Her eyes were glistening, but the tears did not fall. She was holding them back deliberately. She was not grieving in the way one would expect after losing a husband. No, she was maintaining control, and I could not shake the feeling that it was for a reason. "Madame, I must ask you, did anyone else see this apparition?" I inquired, keeping my voice gentle. She shook her head quickly, her hair tumbling slightly over her shoulders. "No one. It was just me, I swear. It was late, and the house was quiet." I couldn't understand it. I pressed my lips together, considering her words. "But you were certain it was him?" Her gaze flickered briefly before she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I knew it was him." I studied her carefully. There was something in the way she spoke, a subtle hesitation, a hint of doubt. Mrs. Hadley had described her husband as if she had seen him with her own eyes, but the more she spoke, the more I doubted the truth of her words. How could she have been so certain? And why did her description sound so vague, so detached? Was it grief that clouded her vision, or was it something else? I leaned in slightly, trying to gauge her reaction. "Tell me, madam," I began carefully, "how did you and your husband get along in the months leading up to his death? Was there any tension between you?" Her response was immediate, almost too swift. No tension. We had our disagreements, of course, but nothing out of the ordinary. Gregory was a good man. We had our ups and downs, but who doesn't? Her words seemed too rehearsed, too smooth. I detected the faintest shift in her tone when she spoke of Gregory as a good man. It was as if she were trying to convince herself of the fact, but was it true? Or was she attempting to create an image of the perfect husband, a facade to cover something darker beneath? "I see," I said, my voice calm, betraying no hint
of my thoughts. "And the matter of the will, madam? Were there any changes recently? Gregory and you, did you ever discuss his affairs in the weeks before his death?"
Her eyes widened imperceptibly, and she quickly averted her gaze, as if I had struck a nerve. It was only a brief flash, but it told me everything I needed to know. The mention of the will had unsettled her deeply. "No, we didn't discuss it," she said quickly, too quickly. "Gregory was always so private about such matters. I had no reason to believe anything had changed. I couldn't help but press on. It is curious, is it not, madame? A man with so many assets, so much at stake. He would not neglect such matters without good reason. Yet you tell me there was nothing unusual." She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sharp, grating sound.
"I am telling you the truth, Monsieur Poirot," she exclaimed, her voice quivering now. "Please, I don't know what more you want from me. I've told you everything." I allowed her outburst to settle before speaking again, my voice low
and reassuring. "Madame, I do not doubt your words, but you must understand that for the truth to emerge, everything must be examined, no matter how uncomfortable it may be." Her expression softened, but she did not meet my gaze. I understand, Monsieur Poirot. I want the truth too. I want to know what happened to Gregory. Please find out who did this." I stood, my mind turning over the fragments of her words, her behavior, the way she skirted around certain topics with unnerving ease. There was more to Mrs. Hadley's story than she was willing to admit. I felt certain of it. And if I was to uncover the truth, I would need to dig deeper. As I turned to leave, I cast one final glance back at her. She was staring out the window, again, her face unreadable, her hands clasped tightly together. It struck me that she seemed more like a woman preparing for something, rather than one mourning the loss of a loved one. The widow had been careful in her answers, but she had left me with more questions than I had come with. What had truly happened in the garden that night? And what was it that she was hiding? Her conflicting emotions, her evasion, all pointed to something far more sinister lurking beneath the surface. As I made my way down the corridor, I realized the case had only just begun to unravel. I would return to her, no doubt. But for now, I needed to gather more pieces. There was something I was missing, a connection I had yet to make, and it would come to me. I was certain of it. Chapter 5. The Servants' Stories. The following day dawned with the grey pall of rain threatening on the horizon. The mist hung thick in the air as I made my way to the servants' quarters. The house had an unsettling silence about it, the air thick with suspicion. After my conversation with Mrs. Hadley, I found myself reflecting on her behaviour. There were too many inconsistencies, too many evasions. It was clear she was hiding something, perhaps not out of malice, but perhaps out of fear. And yet there was more at play here than simple grief. I had gathered all the information I could from the family members, but now it was time to turn my attention to the staff. A family's servants often know far more than they let on, and I could only imagine what secrets they might hold. First, I encountered the butler, Mr. Cartwright, a man whose impeccable uniform and stiff demeanour suggested a man who took his duties with an almost obsessive seriousness. He was in his late 50s, his grey hair neatly combed, his posture ramrod.
Straight.
The moment I entered the drawing room where we had arranged to meet, he stood promptly and motioned for me to sit. "Mr. Poirot," he said, his voice low and polite, "I trust you find everything to your satisfaction." I have not yet had a full opportunity to explore the estate, but I find it, shall we say, most intriguing, I replied. "There is something about this place, monsieur, that suggests all is not as it seems. Now I must ask you, Mr. Cartwright, did you notice
Anything unusual in the days leading up to Mr. Hadley's death?"
He hesitated for only a moment before answering, but I noticed the slight tension in his jaw. "I have been in Mr. Hadley's service for over 30 years, Monsieur Poirot. I can honestly say that nothing out of the ordinary occurred. The master was a man of routine, of regular habits, nothing that would have given me cause to suspect anything untoward." I studied him carefully. There was something in his eyes, perhaps a flicker of something, he was not willing to share. The servants often knew more than they were willing to admit, especially in a household like this one, where wealth and power mingled with secrets. "And the night of Mr. Hadley's death? Were you on duty?" "I was, monsieur. But I retired early that night. I had not been feeling well, and the master was already asleep. I heard nothing unusual, and I saw nothing out of the ordinary." His answer was straightforward, perhaps too straightforward. I decided to press further, but before I could speak, he continued, "Of course, the day after the funeral it was strange. There was a great deal of talk among the staff. Mrs. Hadley seemed distraught, naturally, but she was also quite insistent that we maintain a sense of normalcy." "Did she seem particularly agitated?" I asked, narrowing my eyes slightly. "Well," Cartwright paused, shifting uncomfortably. "She was upset, yes, but nothing out of the ordinary for a widow." His words rang hollow, as though he were repeating a script rather than sharing his true feelings. He was hiding something. His answer was too careful. "Very well, Mr. Cartwright. I appreciate your candor. If you think of anything else, anything at all, do not hesitate to inform me." I left him standing by the fire, still stiff and formal. My instincts told me there was more to his story than he was willing to share, but I had learned nothing concrete in this interview. It was time to speak with the housekeeper. Mrs. Parker was a woman in her early 40s, sharp-eyed and no-nonsense. When she entered the drawing-room to meet me, she carried herself with an air of authority, and there was no pretense of cordiality. She was a woman who had seen and heard much in her time. "Mr. Poirot," she greeted me briskly, "I suppose you are here to ask questions about the death of Mr. Hadley?" "Indeed, madame," I replied. "I understand you were in the household for many years. You must have witnessed the ebb and flow of family life here." "I've been here for 10 years, yes," she answered, folding her hands in front of her.
"And I'll admit, it hasn't been the most peaceful of places. The Hadley family have always been a complicated lot, especially when it comes to money." "Money," I mused. "Yes, it often brings out the darker sides of people. Tell me."
"Mrs. Parker, did you notice anything unusual the night Mr. Hadley died, or perhaps in the days leading up to it?" She hesitated, as if measuring her words. "I didn't see anything unusual, not at first. But there was something odd about the way Mrs. Hadley acted after the funeral. She seemed distracted, as if her mind was elsewhere. It was as if she were waiting for something." "Waiting for something?" I echoed, leaning forward. "Yes, monsieur. It's hard to describe, but it was as if she were on edge, looking over her shoulder, almost as though she expected someone, or something, to appear. I've never seen her like that before." "And the night of Mr. Hadley's death?" "I went to bed early that night, but when I passed through the hall, I noticed the light from the study still on. Mrs. Hadley was in there, reading or writing, I suppose. She didn't look up when I passed. It was strange, though. The whole house felt like it was holding its breath. I made a note of her words, though they did little to clarify things. Mrs. Parker had noticed something, but it was too vague to be of much use. There was a sense of unease, but it was not rooted in anything specific. Still, I would not discount her observations entirely. Finally, I made my way to the gardener, Mr. Morris. He was a stocky man in his mid-30s, with rough hands and a perpetually furrowed brow. He had been with the family for several years, and he had the air of someone who knew the grounds better than anyone else. "I suppose you've come to ask about the garden," he said when I arrived, his tone flat and without surprise. "I've been working here for years, so I've seen my fair share of things." "I have heard," I replied, "that you were out in the garden the night Mr. Hadley died."
"Is that correct?" "Aye," he said, scratching his chin. "I was out there, but it wasn't anything strange. Just doing my rounds, checking the plants, making sure everything was in order. I've been keeping the garden in shape for years now." "And you didn't hear anything unusual?" I pressed. Mr. Morris looked down, avoiding my gaze for a moment.
"Well, now that you mention it, I did hear something odd. Footsteps, soft, like someone walking on the gravel. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was late, after all, and the house is always so quiet at night. But the footsteps, there was something off about them. I didn't see anyone, but I'm sure I heard them." "Where did you hear these footsteps?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "In the back garden, near the hedge," he said, pointing vaguely toward the rear.
"Of the house?"
"Could have been the wind, I suppose, but it didn't sound like the wind. More like someone walking, moving quietly." "And did you investigate further?" I asked. "No, sir. I thought it was just someone else from the household. I didn't."
"Think much of it. But now that you mention it, maybe it wasn't just the wind." His words struck me with a jolt of realization.
Could it be that someone had entered the garden that night under the guise of a ghost? And if so, who could it have been? Mrs. Hadley had claimed to see her husband, but could it have been someone else entirely? Someone trying to deceive her, or worse, someone trying to cover up their actions? I thanked Mr. Morris and left the garden, my mind racing. The inconsistencies in the staff's stories were beginning to form a pattern. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but there was still something I was missing. I would need to return to the family soon, but first I needed to consider the possibility that the ghost in the garden might not have been a ghost at all. Someone was manipulating the widow, and I intended to find out who. Chapter 6. The Willers. I returned to the drawing-room. The tension of the previous hours weighed heavily on my shoulders. I had spoken with the staff, gathered their accounts, and yet there was still a sense that something crucial was missing. Mrs. Hadley's behaviour, her evasion, and the odd comments from the gardener, all of it pointed to a deeper mystery, a tangled web of deceit and manipulation. But there was more to uncover, and it lay hidden within the late Mr. Hadley's affairs. It was time to examine his will. The will had been placed in my hands only moments before, and I had yet to give it the proper attention it deserved. Gregory Hadley, a man of considerable wealth and influence, had left behind a substantial fortune, yet the details of his will were as convoluted as the life he had led. If there was any truth to the suggestion that Gregory's death had been no accident, then his final wishes might hold the key to understanding the events leading up to his demise. I carefully unfolded the document, taking care not to tear the edges. The paper was aged but still sturdy, the ink crisp despite the passage of time. I scanned through the preamble first, a rather standard declaration of intent, naming his wife, Mrs. Hadley, as the primary beneficiary of his estate. But as I read further, my eyes caught on a peculiar clause, one I had not expected. A sum of £1,000,000 shall be allocated to the Haven Foundation under the following conditions: that the widow, Mrs. Elizabeth Hadley, personally agrees to comply with certain stipulations, the details of which shall be disclosed at the time of execution. Failure to comply with these conditions will result in the forfeiture of the entire bequest. The phrasing struck me as odd. It was unusually precise, far more so than one would expect from a man who had always struck me as somewhat distant in his dealings. Why would Gregory Hadley place such an elaborate condition on a charitable donation? Most men in his position would have simply left the sum to the charity without any further conditions. I set the will aside momentarily, letting my mind work. The conditions were clearly important, yet their exact nature was not immediately clear. Why had Gregory insisted upon them, and why had he made them contingent on his wife's agreement? I folded the paper and made my way to the study where Mrs. Hadley was waiting for me. She had insisted on meeting me there, as though to remind me of the propriety of the Hadley household. There was an air of calculation about her now, something colder than before. She had not been expecting questions about the will, that much was certain. When I entered, she greeted me with a curt nod. Her eyes, however, betrayed a flicker of apprehension. "Monsieur Poirot, I trust you have made some progress in your investigation?" she asked, her voice laced with tension. "Ah, madam," I replied, taking my seat across from her. "I have been examining the will of your late husband. A most intriguing document, I must say." She raised an eyebrow, but her expression remained guarded. "And what have you discovered?" "The will contains an unusual provision, one that is, how shall I say, rather specific. A sum of money is to be given to a charity, but only if you agree to certain conditions." I paused, watching her carefully. "I wonder, madam, do you know what those conditions are?" For a moment there was no response. Her lips tightened as she stared at me, and the room seemed to grow colder, though the fire still crackled in the hearth. "I am not sure what you mean, Monsieur Poirot," she said finally, her voice tight. "I have not seen the will since. It was read to me after Gregory's death. If there are conditions attached, I suppose I will find out in due course." "Ah, but madame," I pressed, leaning forward slightly, "the conditions are not vague, you see. They are most specific. It seems that your late husband was very concerned about the execution of his charitable donations. Why would such a condition be placed on the bequest? A man of his wealth would hardly have been so meticulous about such matters, unless there was something significant at stake." Her eyes flickered just for an instant. But it was enough. There was something in her reaction, something unspoken, that stirred a sense of unease in me. Mrs. Hadley had known about the condition, of course. She had to have known. And yet she was playing the part of the grieving widow, the innocent woman who had been caught unaware. "Gregory was always so particular about his affairs," she said, with a forced smile, her voice tinged with an emotion I couldn't quite place. He was a man of principle. He cared deeply about his causes. I watched her closely, but she was giving nothing away. The smile never reached her eyes, and her fingers twitched nervously, as though she were grasping for something just out
of reach. "I would very much like to see the details of those conditions, madame," I said, my voice calm but insistent. Her hand tightened on the edge of her chair, and for a moment I thought she might refuse outright. Then, as if a decision
had been made, she exhaled slowly and nodded. "I will speak with my solicitor," she said, her voice cool again. "But as I have said, Monsieur Poirot, there is little more I can offer. I cannot control what is written in the will." "I understand," I said, standing up. "But, madame, I would implore you to consider carefully what is at stake here. Your husband's death was not an accident, and I am certain that the truth lies hidden within the details of this document." I left her then, with her cool composure barely concealing the storm beneath. Mrs. Hadley knew more than she had let on. But what was she hiding? I returned to the study, my mind turning over the possibilities. The conditions in the will were the key to understanding Gregory's final wishes and perhaps his death. I needed to learn more about the Haven Foundation, the charity to which Gregory had left a sizable sum. The name itself seemed oddly fitting, a foundation meant to be a sanctuary, a refuge. But why would Gregory place such a large sum there, with strings attached? I could feel the puzzle pieces beginning to fit together in my mind, though the picture was still incomplete. I would need to speak to Gregory's solicitor. Perhaps he could shed light on the conditions of the bequest. And there was something else. The idea that someone might have manipulated Gregory's final wishes seemed increasingly likely. Who stood to benefit from such a precise bequest? Mrs. Hadley, of course, but was there anyone else? As I walked out of the study, I could feel the weight of the case pressing on me. I was closer, yes, but the answers were still shrouded in mystery. And then I recalled something from my interview with the gardener. He had mentioned hearing footsteps in the garden. Could it be that someone had visited Gregory's grave, or perhaps even had something to do with the changes in the will? There were too many questions still left unanswered, and as I made my way toward the solicitor's office, I had the distinct feeling that someone was watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. Chapter 7. Psychological Profiles as a... I sat in the drawing room, my thoughts swirling. I could not escape the feeling that we were merely skimming the surface of a far deeper mystery. The will, Mrs. Hadley's elusive behaviour, and the strange remarks from the staff, everything pointed to a carefully constructed web of deceit. But who had spun it, and why? My attention turned toward the psychological profiles of those most closely connected to Gregory Hadley. I had spoken with his widow, Mrs. Hadley, and she had left a strong impression on me. There was something unsettling about her demeanour, a quiet intensity that suggested she was hiding something important. But it was not just her. There were others whose motives and behaviours warranted closer scrutiny, particularly Gregory's brother, Charles. I had learned that the relationship between Gregory and Charles had been strained in recent years. The reasons for their growing distance were not immediately clear, but the tensions were undeniable. Charles had once been part of the family business, but he had been cut off from the family fortune following a series of disagreements with Gregory. The details of those disagreements had remained vague, but the implications were clear. Charles had been left with little more than his pride. It was a familiar story, one that Poirot had encountered more than once in his career. A sibling rivalry festering for years, culminating in bitter resentment. And what better motive for murder than a sibling who stood to gain from the death of the other? I made my way to the library where I had arranged to meet Charles Hadley. As I entered, I found him sitting by the fire, his face set in a grim expression. He did not look up immediately, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "Charles Hadley," I said, my voice breaking the silence. "It is good to see you. I trust you are well?" He raised his eyes slowly, acknowledging me with a curt nod. "Monsieur Poirot." "Yes, I suppose I am well enough, considering the circumstances." I seated, myself opposite him, watching carefully. There was a weariness about him, but it wasn't the kind of exhaustion one would expect from a man mourning his brother. It was the weariness of someone who had long been carrying a burden too heavy to bear. "I trust you do not mind me asking about your relationship with your late brother," I began, watching for any signs of tension. "It has come to my attention that the two of you had some disagreements, particularly regarding the family fortune. Could you speak to that?" Charles stiffened slightly, but he quickly recovered his composure. "Gregory and we had our differences, yes, but who doesn't? We were brothers after all." His voice was controlled, but I noticed the faintest edge to it. In the end, Gregory and I agreed to part ways, he with his business, and I with mine. It was a clean break. "Ah," I said, leaning forward slightly. "A clean break, yes. But you would not be human if such a break did not leave its mark, no?" Charles was silent for a moment, as though weighing his words carefully. Finally, he spoke, his tone flat. "I did not ask for any of this. Gregory was a proud man, too proud to see reason. When he cut me off, it was as though I ceased to exist in his eyes. But I did not murder him, Monsieur Poirot. If you think that, you are mistaken. I studied him closely, noting the subtle twitch of his fingers as he gripped the armrest of his chair. There was anger in him, yes, but it was not the anger of a man who had just lost a brother. It was the anger of someone who felt wronged, someone who had been denied what he believed was rightfully his. "I do not believe you murdered him,"
I said softly. "But I do believe that your relationship with your brother may hold the key to understanding the circumstances of his death." Charles's eyes narrowed. "You think I killed him for money?" I did not respond immediately, instead,
studying his face. There was a faint flicker of something in his expression, a flash of something like regret or guilt. But then it was gone, replaced by a mask of indifference. "You were cut off from the family fortune, yes?" I asked, my voice calm but probing. That must have been a significant blow. Charles's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "Tell."
"Me?" I continued. "Did you ever consider taking matters into your own hands? After all, Gregory's death would certainly improve your situation."
For a moment, Charles said nothing. The fire crackled in the silence, its light dancing across his face. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I've never been a murderer, Poirot. Not like that." "Ah," I said, my eyes narrowing. "But sometimes, when the situation is dire enough, one might find oneself in a position where such things become tempting." Charles shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but he held my gaze. "I never would have killed Gregory. Not for money. Not for anything." There was something in his eyes now, something that gave me pause. It was not quite guilt, but it was close. A hint of something darker, something buried deep beneath the surface, but I had no proof, no concrete evidence that Charles Hadley had anything to do with his brother's death. He was, at best, a suspect with a motive, but nothing more. I left. Charles Hadley, alone in the library, his eyes following me as I made my way back down the hallway. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story than he was willing to admit. But the question remained, if not Charles, then who? My thoughts turned briefly to Clara Hadley, Gregory's niece. Clara was a young woman, just past her 20s, and she had always been the quiet one in the family. But there was something about her that intrigued me. She stood to inherit a significant sum should her aunt pass away. And if there was one thing I had learned from my years of experience, it was that money had a way of changing people. I decided to pay Clara a visit. Her room was located in a quiet corner of the house, tucked away from the hustle and bustle of the other occupants. When I knocked on her door, she opened it immediately, her expression one of polite curiosity. "Monsieur Poirot?" she said softly, stepping aside to
"Let me in."
"I did not expect to see you again so soon." "Ah, mademoiselle," I said, bowing slightly as I entered. "I trust you are well?" She smiled faintly, but there was a certain wariness in her eyes that I had not noticed before. "I'm doing as well as can be expected given the circumstances." We sat down, and I wasted no time in getting to the point. "Mademoiselle, I must ask you, how well did you know your uncle Gregory?" She stiffened slightly, her fingers twitching in her lap. "I knew him well enough. He was a distant man, but he was family." "And your relationship with your aunt?" I asked, watching her closely. Clara's smile faltered slightly, and I could see her hands clench. "My aunt and I, we don't always see eye to eye, but she is family, and I care for her." I studied her carefully, noting the subtle tension in her posture. There was more to her answer than she was letting on. "I see," I said slowly, my voice measured. "And if something were to happen to your aunt, you would stand to inherit a substantial sum, would you not?" Clara's face went pale, and for a brief moment her composure slipped. I suppose so," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I leaned forward, my gaze steady. "Mademoiselle, your inheritance is a significant one. It is only
natural that one might question how far you might go to ensure it." Clara's eyes widened, and for a second I thought she might break down entirely.
But she held herself together, her lips pressing together in a tight line. "I don't know what you're suggesting, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I loved my uncle. I never wanted anything bad to happen to him." I said nothing, but my mind was already turning, piecing together the fragments of this complex puzzle. Clara's potential motive was clear, but was she the one who had been behind Gregory's death, or had someone else manipulated her into playing a part? As I left her room, my mind was alive with questions. There were still many pieces to fit together, but one thing was becoming clear. Someone in this house was hiding something, and soon I would uncover what it was. Chapter 8. The Late Night Visitor. The house was quiet as I made my way through the dimly lit corridors, my mind still heavy with the words exchanged in Clara's room. She had been evasive, her responses carefully constructed, but not convincing enough to silence the growing suspicion I had. There was something about her reaction to the mention of the inheritance that didn't sit right with me. Was she more involved than she let on, or was there someone else at play here? It was not the answer that had haunted me, but rather the absence of one. The quiet flicker of fear that danced in her eyes suggested that something was missing, an important piece that I was still struggling to find. I was standing in the hallway when I was approached by the housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, who had a strange expression on her face. She had been a fixture in the Hadley household for many years, a woman whose loyalty to the family was unquestioned. However, her recent odd behavior, almost as if she were waiting for something to happen, had been something I had noticed in passing. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, in a hushed voice, glancing nervously over her shoulder, as if she feared being overheard. "There's something you must know, something I should have told you earlier, but I didn't." I motioned for her to continue, and she led me into a small sitting room where the warmth of the fire was a welcome contrast to the chilly uncertainty in the air. "Clara," she began, her voice dropping even lower. "She wasn't where she should have been that night. The night Gregory died." I raised an eyebrow. "You are certain of this?" Mrs. Winters nodded solemnly. "I'm not one to gossip, Monsieur Poirot, but I saw her. She came back late, very late, well after midnight. She wasn't supposed to be here at all, but I saw her through the window, sneaking through the garden like a shadow." My mind whirled with this new revelation. Clara Hadley had been out of the house in the early hours at a time when Gregory's life had already been extinguished. Could this be the lead I was looking for? Did anyone else see her? I asked. Not that I know of, sir.
No one was awake at that hour except for me. But I'm certain of what I saw. I sat back, my mind racing. There was a subtle urgency to Mrs. Winter's words. She had withheld this information earlier, and now it seemed that it was precisely
the kind of detail that could shift the investigation into a new direction. But what had Clara been doing outside in the dead of night? And why had she returned so late? You are sure of the hour? I asked again, hoping she would elaborate further. I watched the clock, sir, she replied. It was just past 1.
o'clock when I saw her slip through the garden. I nodded, my thoughts already forming a clear pattern. Clara had been out when her uncle died, or at least at the very least, during the time when Gregory had been discovered lifeless in his study.
But there was something else bothering me. If Clara had been outside so late, why hadn't anyone noticed her return? It didn't make sense until I recalled her earlier statement. She had mentioned nothing about the garden. Had she been hiding something? As if on cue, Mrs. Winters pulled a small object from her pocket. I found this morning in the garden. It's from Gregory's collection. It must have fallen off when Clara was out there. I took the object from her hand, turning
it over in my fingers. It was a ring, an ornate piece of jewellery with a large sapphire set in the centre.
I had seen it in Gregory's study, part of a larger collection of antique rings that had been a point of pride for him. His most prized possessions, including this one, were always kept in a locked cabinet, a collection to which only the family had access. But Clara had no reason to be in the garden that night, at least not the kind of reason that would explain her possession of such an object. This was found in the garden, I asked, raising an eyebrow. And Clara claims she merely found it? Mrs. Winters nodded. Yes, sir. She said she found it out there lying in the dirt, but... But? I pressed. She seemed odd. She was nervous when I asked about it. She kept saying she hadn't seen it before, yet there it was, just lying there in the grass. I leaned back, my mind piecing together this new set of circumstances. The late-night excursion, the missing ring, and Clara's unusual behaviour all pointed to one thing, a deeper involvement than she was letting on. But was Clara the only one hiding something, or was she merely playing a part in someone else's scheme? I turned to Mrs. Winters, who was watching me closely, almost as if she expected me to unravel it all in an instant. But Poirot, as any seasoned detective knew, did not work in such a manner. The puzzle pieces needed time to settle into their proper places. "Thank you, Mrs. Winters," I said, slipping the ring into my coat pocket for safekeeping. "Your information is most useful. You may return to your duties now." She nodded, her face still filled with uncertainty as she left the room, closing the door quietly behind her. I stood there, alone with my thoughts, the weight of the evidence pressing down on me. The pieces were beginning to fit together, though I was careful not to rush to conclusions. It was too soon, too easy, to simply point the finger at Clara. Her late-night stroll and possession of the ring could be circumstantial, a result of the chaos and confusion following her uncle's death. Yet, a nagging voice in my mind reminded me that it wasn't always the most obvious solution that held the truth. The true culprit might be someone who seemed above suspicion, or worse, someone who had carefully orchestrated their innocence. I resolved to confront Clara once more, but not until I had gathered further information. There were still questions that needed answering, and this new lead, though compelling, did not yet provide the final piece of the puzzle. The sound of footsteps interrupted my thoughts, and I turned to see Inspector Davies approaching. His face was tight with the same worry I had seen in it earlier, though now there was something more. "A new piece of the puzzle, perhaps? Poirot," he said, his voice strained. "There's something you need to see. We found something in the study." I followed him immediately, my thoughts racing. Had they found something important, something that could finally reveal the truth behind Gregory Hadley's death? Or had the investigation taken yet another unexpected turn? I entered the study, where the inspector stood by the desk, looking at something on the floor. "There," he said, pointing to a small scrap of paper near the fireplace. "It was hidden in the ash. It seems to be part of a letter." I bent down to examine the paper. It was crumpled and singed at the edges, but the ink was still legible. It looked like a note written in haste, something Gregory had perhaps been in the middle of before his untimely demise. "Ah," I murmured, recognizing the handwriting. "This will tell us everything, I believe." I stood up, slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle on my shoulders. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, and it was now only a matter of time before I could reveal the truth. Chapter 9. False leads and misdirection. The scrap of paper in my hand felt strangely heavy, as if it carried with it the weight of all the uncertainty that had clouded this investigation thus far. The words on the crumpled sheet were sharp, hurried, and unmistakably Gregory's handwriting. However, the message itself was ambiguous, a jumbled collection of thoughts that barely made sense. It looked as though Gregory had been in a state of distress when he wrote it, perhaps even a moment of confusion or fear, though for what I could not yet tell. I looked up at Inspector Davies, who was standing across the room, his expression anxious, waiting for me to make sense of it all. "What does it mean, Poirot?" he asked, his voice low. I stared at the paper, my mind churning through the possibilities. It was clear that whatever Gregory had been about to say had been cut short, as if he had been interrupted. But who could have done it? More importantly,
"Why, it is difficult to say, my friend," I replied. "But there is a message here, hidden within the chaos of these words. I believe we are dealing with something far more intricate than we first assumed."
Davies frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Gregory had something to say, something important. But perhaps he was not certain who he could trust. Perhaps that is why this message was hidden so carelessly." As I spoke, the door creaked open, and Mrs. Winters entered, her face pale. Her eyes darted nervously between Davies and myself, clearly uncomfortable in our company. "I apologize for intruding, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice trembling. "But there's something I must tell you, something I should have told."
"You earlier?" I stood up, my attention immediately sharpening. The housekeeper had been a constant presence in this investigation, but she had been largely silent about the most pressing matters.
That she was now coming forward suggested that she had information of some importance, or perhaps something that could change the course of the investigation altogether. "What is it, Mrs. Winters?" I asked, my tone soft but firm, encouraging her to speak. She hesitated, taking a step closer to the desk. "It's about the widow, Mrs. Hadley." "Go on," I said, intrigued. The mention of the widow was always a touchy subject, as she had seemed to be under the scrutiny of everyone in the house. It was not that she had no alibi, but rather the peculiarities of her behavior that had kept her firmly in the spotlight. "I overheard something," Mrs. Winters continued. "She was speaking to herself late one night. I didn't mean to listen, but she said something about seeing Gregory's ghost." She said he was still here in the house, watching her. A chill ran through me. Gregory's ghost? It seemed a bizarre and nonsensical thing to believe, unless, of course, it was part of a much larger game. The more I heard about Mrs. Hadley's fragile mental state, the more I wondered if her own mind was playing tricks on her. But then, why had Mrs. Winters hesitated to speak of it? "You did not mention this before, Mrs. Winters," I pointed out, my voice steady but questioning. She visibly flinched at the remark. No, I didn't. I thought it was just my imagination, and I didn't want to trouble anyone." I studied her for a long moment, my eyes narrowing as I assessed her behavior. There was more to this than met the eye. Mrs. Winters had not simply failed to mention a random, incoherent statement. She had been withholding something. Why? Was she protecting Mrs. Hadley, or was she hiding something far more sinister? "Mrs. Winters," I said softly, my tone gentle yet insistent, "I believe you know more than you are letting on. You must tell me everything you heard. Do not hide the truth any longer." The housekeeper swallowed, her hands wringing together in front of her. "I didn't want to get involved. It's just—" She was speaking so urgently. She said the ghost was trying to communicate with her, that it wanted her to do something. "Do something?" I repeated, my mind racing. "What exactly did she say?" Mrs. Winters hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously toward the door, as though expecting someone to overhear. I don't know, Monsieur Poirot. She kept saying something about she had to finish it, whatever it was. She didn't make sense, but she sounded frightened, like she was being controlled. A faint shiver ran down my spine. Could it be that Mrs. Hadley was not simply grieving the loss of her husband, but that she was being manipulated, perhaps by someone within the house, or someone who had long since left? I could not dismiss this idea so easily. "Very well," I said, my voice calm. "Thank you, Mrs. Winters. You have been most helpful. But I must ask you, did anyone else hear this conversation?" "I don't think so, sir," she replied, shaking her head. "It was late at night, and everyone else was in their rooms. But you should know this too. She wasn't the only one acting strangely that night." "Who else?" I asked sharply, feeling a new lead form in my mind. "Mr. Charles Hadley," she replied quickly, almost too quickly. "I saw him sneaking into the study not long before, before the discovery. He looked like he was in a hurry, as though he was trying to avoid being seen. He didn't notice me." This revelation stopped me in my tracks. Charles Hadley, the disgruntled brother who had been cut off from the family fortune, had indeed become a suspect in my mind, but now his actions were adding a new layer to his involvement. Why would he be sneaking around so late? Had he been looking for something or someone? "Thank you, Mrs. Winters," I said, my voice cool but appreciative. "I will need to speak to Charles again. Please leave me now." She nodded, her eyes downcast as she retreated from the room, leaving me to absorb the new information. There were now two people I needed to focus on more intently: Mrs. Hadley and her ghostly claims, and Charles with his unexplained actions. I turned back to the desk, my eyes falling on the scrap of paper that I had found earlier. The lines were still illegible to me, but the more I thought about the oddities of the case, the clearer it became. I was being led down several different paths at once. The haunting, the family rift, the strange behavior of both widow and brother, it all seemed to point in a direction, but where? There was one thing I knew for certain. I had only begun to scratch the surface. The truth was out there, but it was hidden behind layers of misdirection and false leads. And until I unraveled the tangled web, the mystery would remain unsolved. With a deep breath, I stood up and made my way toward the door, resolved to confront Charles Hadley once more. There was still much to learn, and the clock was ticking. Chapter 10. The Psychological Breakdown. The night had descended with an almost oppressive stillness, the silence of the manor broken only by the occasional creak of wood or the distant rustling of leaves in the garden. I stood before Mrs. Hadley's study door, the key to which I had obtained after much persuasion. The widow had been reluctant to allow me inside, but after the new revelations from Mrs. Winters, I could not ignore the growing suspicion that something significant lay hidden within these walls. As I turned the key in the lock and pushed the door open, the air inside seemed to hold its breath. The study, though elegantly furnished, had an air of disuse. The bookshelves, filled with leather-bound volumes, stood neatly arranged, and the desk was polished, though slightly neglected, as though its owner spent little time here of late. Yet there was a certain tension in the room that I could not quite place. It was as if the space itself had been waiting for me. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the room with methodical precision. Mrs. Hadley had been known for her grace, for her outward poise, but I now suspected that there was a great deal more beneath that surface. Grief, yes, but was it truly grief, or was it a mask for something far more complex? The desk was cluttered with papers, most of them bills and correspondence that seemed unimportant. But then I noticed it. A small, nondescript folder, slightly out of place amid the chaos. It was tucked away in a drawer, not hidden, but placed there with a deliberate carelessness, as if someone had meant to conceal it without attracting attention. My fingers brushed over the edges of the folder, and I pulled it free. The contents inside were mostly personal letters, some from friends, others from distant relatives, but there was one letter, folded neatly and sealed with a wax stamp, that caught my attention. The handwriting was unfamiliar, sharp and angular, and the ink seemed to have faded with time. I sat down at the desk, my mind racing. The letter had been written years ago, and it was addressed to Mrs. Hadley before her marriage to Gregory. The words, though faint, were clear enough. It was a letter from someone named Edward, urging her to come back to him, to abandon Gregory, and to start over with him, away from the wealthy but suffocating life she had chosen. Edward had seemed to know her well, perhaps too well, and in the lines of his letter, I could sense a desperation, an urgency that seemed out of place. Had Mrs. Hadley's past caught up with her? Was it possible that this letter had anything to do with Gregory's death? I tucked the letter back into the folder, making a mental note to return to it later. I was about to rise from the desk when a soft noise at the door made me freeze. I turned to see Mrs. Hadley standing in the doorway, her pale face framed by the dark shadows of the hallway. Her eyes were wide, not in surprise, but in something more unsettling, recognition. "Did you find what you were looking for, Monsieur Poirot?" she asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. I had no intention of denying my presence here, nor did I plan to offer an apology. "I am only looking for the truth, madame," I said, my tone measured, though there was a quiet authority beneath. The words, "And it seems that the past has a way of revealing itself." She stepped inside, and I noted the way her hands trembled as they clasped together, her wedding ring glittering faintly in the dim light. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, her voice wavering just slightly. I gestured to the folder on the desk, my gaze never leaving hers. "This letter, Madame Hadley. It is from someone named Edward." "You knew him, I presume?" Her face went pale, and she took a step back. "Edward," her voice cracked. "That was years ago. A foolish infatuation.
It has nothing to do with what happened to Gregory. Nothing at all? I asked, my voice calm but firm. But you must admit, madame, that a letter like this does suggest something more. A relationship, unfinished, perhaps? Her eyes darted to the letter, and for a moment I thought I saw
A flicker of panic in her gaze, but she quickly composed herself, folding her arms tightly across her chest. It is all in the past, Monsieur Poirot. Gregory knew about Edward. He knew, and he forgave me. That is all that matters. I could sense her unease, the cracks in her composure growing wider with every passing second. But there was something more here, something beneath the surface. The letter was not just an old relic of an affair. It was a clue, a potential motive, something that linked Mrs. Hadley's past to her present. And Gregory's murder was at the center of it all. Forgiveness is a powerful thing, I said slowly, observing her every movement. But one must wonder, madame, whether forgiveness ever truly heals the wounds of the past. Sometimes it only buries them deeper until they resurface. She stood still, her gaze fixed on the letter, and for a moment I could almost hear the echo of her thoughts, the uncertainty that lingered in her mind. Then, with a sharp intake of breath, she turned away from the desk, her voice soft but resolute. I
loved Gregory, she said, her back still to me. But there were things I could never tell him, things I could never let him know. I stood in silence for a long moment, considering her words. There was so much left unsaid, so much hidden
in the corners of this house, and yet, even as the truth seemed within my grasp, I knew that it would take more than just a letter or a confession to uncover it. As I left the study, I could feel Mrs. Hadley's eyes on my back, her gaze heavy with something I could not quite place. Was it guilt, or was it fear? Perhaps both. Down the hall I ran into Charles Hadley, his face flushed as though he had been waiting for something or someone. His eyes narrowed when he saw me, but he quickly masked his emotions with a polite smile. "Monsieur Poirot," he greeted me, with an air of forced cheerfulness. "I trust you are finding everything to your satisfaction?" "I am, Monsieur Hadley," I replied, my voice steady. "But I must ask, have you had a chance to reflect on the events of that evening?" He stiffened, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "I've told you everything I know?" "And yet," I said, stepping closer, "there is still so much we do not know, is there?" His eyes flicked nervously to the side, and for the briefest moment I thought I saw a flash of something, an emotion, a thought, that he quickly buried. "I suggest you come to me if you need anything further, Poirot," he said, his voice clipped before turning abruptly and walking down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence. As I watched him retreat, the final piece of the puzzle seemed to elude me, just beyond my reach. Mrs. Hadley, her past with Edward, Charles, and his uncomfortable demeanour. Everything pointed to something, but what? The more I thought about it, the more the mystery deepened, and I knew that I would have to push harder if I were to unravel it. But as I left the study and descended the stairs, the question that haunted me most was simple. Was Mrs. Hadley's grief genuine? Or was there something darker at play? The answers, I knew, would soon come to light, but would they be what I expected? Chapter 11. Twists and Turns. The manor was as still as a tomb when I called everyone together. The walls seemed to echo with the weight of the secrets contained within them, each inch of the house steeped in the tension that had thickened over the past days. I had spent hours reviewing my notes, comparing the accounts of the widow, the housekeeper, Charles Hadley, and even the gardener. Every account, while seemingly innocent in its own way, now seemed to spin an intricate web of contradictions that demanded to be untangled. I had made the decision to bring the suspects together to allow them the opportunity to tell their stories, once again, this time in each other's presence. There was something about the way their alibis had crumbled under even the lightest scrutiny that made me suspect they were all hiding something. Each version of events was skewed by emotion, by motive, and by something darker that lingered beneath the surface. It was time to confront them all, and the moment had arrived. Mrs. Hadley, as composed as ever, sat stiffly in the drawing-room, her eyes downcast. She had, it seemed, returned to the role of the grieving widow, but her earlier reaction in the study left me questioning everything I had believed about her. Charles Hadley, his face an inscrutable mask of polite disinterest, leaned against the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. The housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, stood by the window, looking out into the fog, her gaze distant, as though lost in thought. And finally, the gardener, James, stood by the door, his expression unreadable. "Now, everyone," I said, breaking the silence. "We have gathered here to speak of Gregory Hadley, to understand the truth of what happened on that fateful night. Each of you, I trust, has your own version of events." I turned to Mrs. Hadley first, watching her carefully as I spoke. "Madame, you have already told me of your grief, your mourning for your late husband. But I must ask you again, do you truly believe his death was an accident?" Mrs. Hadley's lips tightened slightly. "I have told you everything I know, Monsieur Poirot. My husband was in poor health. I cannot think of
any reason why anyone would harm him." I nodded slowly, sensing the subtle unease behind her words.
There was something she was not saying, something hidden behind the mask of a grieving widow. But for now, I moved on. "And you, Monsieur Hadley," I said, turning my gaze to Charles. "You were the first to discover the body. Is that correct?" "Yes," he replied, his voice steady, though I could detect a slight tension in his posture. "I found him in the study, just as I said." "But you were not with him at the time of his death, were you?" I asked, my eyes narrowing. "You were elsewhere in the house. Your alibi, if I recall, is that you were in the library, reading." Charles hesitated, a flicker of discomfort passing over his features. "Yes, that is correct. I was reading. I was alone." I didn't miss the brief hesitation before he spoke, nor the way his fingers tightened ever so slightly around the lapel of his jacket. It was subtle, but I had learned long ago to trust such things. "And your wife," I continued, "she did not disturb you during that time?" "No, Madame Hadley had no need to visit you in the library." Charles glanced at his wife briefly before shaking his head. "No, she was in her room, I believe. We were both preoccupied." I smiled inwardly. The contradictions were starting to emerge, and they were growing sharper by the minute. The Hadleys' stories did not match, and their uneasy reactions told me that something had gone terribly wrong between them. But there was more to uncover. "Now let us turn to you, Mrs. Winters," I said, turning my attention to the housekeeper. "You have worked here for many years. You have seen Mr. Hadley's decline, I presume?" Mrs. Winters gave a stiff nod, but her face betrayed little emotion. "Yes, monsieur, he had been ill for some time, though he never spoke much about it." "And yet," I pressed, "you heard him speak of something else. Did you not, Mrs. Winters? Something about his death? Something more than just illness?" Her eyes darted to the others, and I saw the briefest flash of uncertainty. I don't know."
"What do you mean, Monsieur Poirot?"
Perhaps you would recall the conversation he had with the gardener a few days before his death. The one in which he spoke of taking out life insurance. I leaned forward, my voice low and deliberate. I understand that Gregory had been obsessed with the idea of his own death. The housekeeper stiffened visibly. That is not something I can speak to, she said quickly, her voice trembling slightly. Mr. Hadley was a private man. He kept such things to himself. But not to James, the gardener, I pointed out. Surely you heard of this? At the mention of his name, James shifted uncomfortably by the door, his gaze momentarily meeting mine before he quickly looked away.
I saw his hands clench at his sides, his knuckles white. James, I said, addressing him directly, perhaps you can shed some light on this matter? Tell me, what was Mr. Hadley's obsession with life insurance? Why would he have taken out a policy?
Just days before his death. James's voice was rough, as though he were forcing the words from his throat. He had been worried, Monsieur Poirot, about his health, his condition. He said he didn't want to leave his family with nothing. He talked about it often, how he feared for his life. The room fell silent for a moment. The idea that Gregory had feared his own death made sense in a way, but it raised more questions than it answered. If Gregory had been so fearful, why hadn't he confided more in his wife or his brother-in-law? Why had he only spoken of these fears to the gardener? Tell me, James, I said, my eyes never leaving his face. Had Mr. Hadley mentioned anything about his own death in the days leading up to it? Anything that might point to his suspecting someone would harm him? James hesitated, his face tightening. No, monsieur, but he was nervous. Jittery, you could say. I never thought much of it at the time. How strange, I murmured. A man so obsessed with his own death that he insures his life, yet does nothing to protect himself from the very people closest to him.
It seems contradictory, n'est-ce pas? The gardener nodded, his eyes darting nervously toward the others. Yes, monsieur, it did seem strange. I let the silence hang in the air, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room.
Each of them, in their own way, seemed to be hiding something. Mrs. Hadley's grief felt too rehearsed. Charles Hadley's alibi was full of holes. Mrs. Winters was far too evasive, and the gardener's knowledge of Gregory's last days raised more questions than it answered. I stood up slowly, my mind working through the tangled web they had all woven. It is clear to me, my friends, that this case is not as straightforward as it appears, I said, my voice calm but filled with an undercurrent of purpose. There are many layers here, many contradictions. But I will uncover the truth. Rest assured
of that. And with that, I left the room, my mind spinning with possibilities. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form, but I knew that to solve it, I would have to dig deeper.
Much deeper. But for now, one thing was certain. The mystery of Gregory Hadley's death was far from over. Chapter 12. Poirot's method. I retired to my room, the shadows outside thickening as night settled over the manor. The room was quiet, save for the soft crackle of the fire. I sat before the small desk in the corner, staring at the carefully laid-out notes and the fragmented accounts from the various witnesses. The pieces of the puzzle, so many of them, were scattered in front of me, each one adding a layer of complexity to a case that had become far murkier than I had first believed. The widow, Mrs. Hadley, had seemed so sincere in her grief, yet her behaviour was troubling. There was an undercurrent to her responses, a hesitation in her eyes when she spoke of her late husband. And Charles, he had been quick to provide an alibi, but his discomfort had not gone unnoticed. The housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, had been tight-lipped, her refusal to discuss Gregory's obsession with death raising more questions than it answered. And James, the gardener, had made it clear that Gregory's paranoia had reached new heights in his final days, but there was still a sense that he, too, was hiding something. I closed my eyes, letting the events of the day replay in my mind. The contradictions, the subtle evasions, the strange behavior of the suspects, it all pointed to one undeniable conclusion. Something had been carefully orchestrated. But who? And why? I turned my attention to the key moment in the case, the discovery of Gregory Hadley's body. There had been no obvious signs of violence. The medical examiner had ruled it as a natural death, a consequence of his long-standing health issues. But that decision, as I had noted earlier, had been premature. One fact, though small and easily overlooked, had stood out to me since the first autopsy report. Gregory's body had been moved after death. The positioning of his limbs and the slight shift of his body on the floor, the examiner had missed it. It was as if someone had carefully rearranged him, possibly to suggest a natural death, to throw off suspicion. The question then was why? I reached for the letter I had found in Mrs. Hadley's study, the one I had yet to mention to anyone. The words on that piece of paper were still fresh in my mind. Gregory had written of his own fears, his suspicions, and his desire to protect his family. It seemed almost prophetic, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. Perhaps he had anticipated his own death. Perhaps he had known that someone would come for him. As I mulled over these details, I was interrupted by a soft knock on my door. "Enter," I called out, rising from my chair. It was James, the gardener, standing in the doorway, his face a mask of concern. He held a letter in his hand, one that had clearly been written in haste. Monsieur Poirot," he stammered. "I've been thinking about what I told you earlier."
And there's something I didn't mention, something you need to know. I gestured for him to come in. What is it, James? He stepped forward, lowering his voice as though he feared being overheard. The letter, monsieur. The one Gregory wrote just before his death. It's... He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as though checking for anyone who might be listening. It's gone. I can't find it. I raised an eyebrow. Gone? You are certain? James nodded. Yes. I've searched the grounds, the house.
The study, everywhere. It was there, and now it's not. But I know what it said, Monsieur Poirot. Gregory was afraid. He feared someone close to him would do him harm. Interesting, I murmured, taking the letter from him. And you believe this letter would have held crucial information? Yes, James said, his voice trembling. I don't know who would have taken it, but I believe it's connected to what happened to him. The gardener's admission stirred something within me. Someone had gone to great lengths to cover up a piece of evidence, something that had clearly unsettled Gregory in his final days. The puzzle was becoming clearer, but the motive remained elusive. The ghost that had appeared on the night of Gregory's death, the one that had so unsettled Mrs. Hadley, had been a ruse, there was no doubt in my mind. But who had played this part, and why? I dismissed James with a final warning to remain vigilant, then returned to my notes. It was clear that I was now looking for someone who had been preparing for Gregory's death, someone who had wanted him gone, but who had not been willing to take the direct approach. The more I thought about it, the more I was convinced that Gregory had been manipulated in his final days, steered towards an inevitable fate. The notion that Gregory had been waiting for death, preparing for it, perhaps he had even chosen it, himself in some way, was beginning to take shape in my mind. But who had pushed him? The flashbacks to Gregory's last moments flooded my thoughts again. I could almost see the scene, the grand study, the feeling of being watched, the whispers of secrets. There was more to that room than anyone had let on. I could sense it. Had seen Gregory's last will and testament, and while it was not unusual, it had been a source of some curiosity. Gregory had made no attempt to alter his will in the days leading up to his death, but his decision to leave everything to his wife, and yet the peculiar stipulation regarding the manor's property. There was something there, something that
could not be ignored. I paced slowly, my thoughts coalescing. The body had been moved after death. That was the key detail. But why? And why had the medical examiner missed it?
if someone had staged the scene, they must have known the body would be discovered soon enough. They had planned it meticulously. But the question still remained, who among the household had been involved? I thought back to the ghost sighting, the moment when Mrs. Hadley had insisted that she had seen her husband risen from the dead. Could she have been part of this elaborate scheme? No, too obvious. Mrs. Hadley was a grief-stricken widow, yes, but her reactions were far too genuine, too raw to be faked. She was not the orchestrator, but perhaps she had unknowingly played into the hands of the true culprit. The more I pieced the details together, the clearer the picture became. Gregory's death was no accident. It had been carefully planned, and the evidence pointed to one of the people closest to him. But which one? Had they used his fear, his obsession with death against him? I returned to the study the following morning, determined to search for the missing letter. Mrs. Hadley was not in the room, and I found myself drawn to the desk once again. The drawer where the letter had once been was now empty, but the faint smell of ink still lingered in the air. It was a small detail, but it suggested the letter had been written not long before Gregory's death. As I examined the papers scattered across the desk, my hand brushed against something unfamiliar, an envelope tucked carefully into the corner of a drawer. I pulled it out, my heart racing with anticipation. This was it, the missing piece. But what would it reveal? I opened the envelope slowly, as though afraid that the contents might explode into something I could not contain. Inside was a letter, written hastily, its words jagged and hurried. "I am not safe here. They know what I know. Please, do not let them find out. I fear my time is short. There is a truth about my past, a truth that could ruin everything. The ghost I saw was not a vision. It was a warning. They are watching me." I closed my eyes, the weight of those words settling over me like a shroud. The ghost was no mere spectre. It was a warning, a carefully crafted illusion meant to drive Gregory to the brink of madness. But who had created it? I had my answer. The end was in sight. The truth was closer than ever before. But there was still one final question left to answer. Who had killed Gregory Hadley? And why had they gone to such lengths to make it look like a natural death? Chapter 13. The final pieces. The morning light filtered through the thick curtains, casting an almost ethereal glow across the room. It had been a long night, one filled with restless thoughts and the weight of Gregory Hadley's unresolved death. Pressing heavily on my mind, the letter, the elusive piece of evidence that had eluded me until now, had changed everything. There were still so many questions, but the answers were beginning to form, piecing together like the final strokes of a painting. I stood before the fireplace, lost in thought, considering the letter's words. The ghost I saw was not a vision. It was a warning. It was a message that told me the ruse had been far more calculated than I had ever suspected. But by whom? Mrs. Hadley's behaviour had been peculiar. An almost theatrical display of grief that I found hard to believe was genuine. Charles, her brother-in-law, seemed eager to provide an alibi, though I had detected a certain unease in his words. But it was Clara, Gregory's personal assistant, who intrigued me the most. She had been present at the manor, and there was something about her demeanour that struck me as off. But still it was not enough to make a definitive conclusion. I glanced once again at my notes, where I had meticulously recorded every interaction and detail. The investigation had reached a critical juncture, and I knew that the breakthrough was close. Yet, as I pondered the possibility of the perpetrator among these three individuals, one small detail that had slipped under my radar suddenly came into focus. The cigarette stub. I had initially dismissed it as an insignificant clue, but now, upon reflection, it seemed far more important. The stub found in the widow's study had been a peculiar detail, almost too carefully placed. It was a brand of cigarette that I was familiar with. It was not a brand that was popular among the general public, but rather one that seemed to have a small, loyal following. That brand was a rare one that I knew only one person in the house smoked, Charles. I recalled the moments when I had spoken with him. He had been quick to mention his preference for cigars, a fact that seemed inconsequential at the time, but the stub in the study did not match that habit. No, it matched the particular cigarette brand that Charles, in his private moments, had been known to smoke, an odd habit for a man who prided himself on his more refined tastes. But why had he left the cigarette stub there, in a place where it could easily be found? I felt the pieces shifting into place. The more I thought about it, the more the scenario seemed to make sense. Gregory had been obsessed with his own death, and his final days had been filled with the unsettling feeling that someone was after him. What if Charles had been that person, not out of malice, but out of some twisted desire for power or wealth? If he had been involved in Gregory's death, he could have staged the scene to look like a natural demise, manipulating the circumstances to his advantage. The ghost was simply a decoy, a way to confuse and misdirect. But why leave the cigarette stub? Why reveal his presence in such a way? It was almost as if Charles had been trying to send a message that in the chaos of grief and fear I had almost missed. I stood, my thoughts spinning, before reaching for the telephone. I needed to speak to the housekeeper, Mrs. Winters. She had been in the manor for years, and her loyalty to the family was unquestioned, or so it seemed. But there was one thing I had not yet asked her about, the peculiar timing of her absence on the night of Gregory's death. It had struck me as odd when she had told me she had been in the kitchen, a place where she could not have missed the disturbance outside Gregory's room. And yet, when I had asked her to recall that night in detail, she had seemed unusually vague. A faint doubt settled in my mind as I waited for her to arrive. Could she too be involved? Was there more to her role in the household than I had considered? The possibility was not to be dismissed, not in this case. Everyone had something to hide. A soft knock on the door interrupted my thoughts. "Enter," I called. Mrs. Winters stepped inside, her face composed, but her eyes were hard to read. She had a way of holding herself that exuded both confidence and a certain air of secrecy. Perhaps it was her age, or perhaps it was simply the years of service to the Hadley family, but there was no mistaking that she knew things that she had kept hidden. "Ah, Mrs. Winters," I said, motioning to the chair in front of my desk. "Please have a seat." She obliged, folding her hands in her lap and regarding me with a steady gaze. "How may I assist you, monsieur?" "Poirot?" I leaned forward, fixing her with a steady, piercing look. "There is one matter I wish to discuss with you, your absence on the night of Mr. Hadley's death." Her eyes flickered, but she remained calm. I told you, Monsieur Poirot, I was in the kitchen preparing the evening meal. I did not hear anything unusual. I murmured, tapping my fingers together. And yet no one else seems to have seen you in the kitchen at that time.
You were not, perhaps, in another part of the house? She stiffened ever so slightly, but her voice remained even. I assure you, monsieur, I was where I said I was. I let the silence hang between us for a moment, allowing the tension to
grow. And the cigarette stub. You did not know it was there, did you? She blinked, the faintest flicker of surprise passing through her eyes before she regained her composure. Cigarette stub, monsieur? Yes, the cigarette stub found in Mrs. Hadley's study. It matches a particular brand that only one person in this house smokes. I leaned forward, my gaze never leaving hers. Charles, I believe? Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. I could sense she was weighing her words, trying to find a way to dismiss or deflect my accusation. And yet, Mrs. Winters, I must ask myself, why would Charles leave his cigarette stub in a place where it would be found? Surely he must have
known it would raise questions. The seconds stretched as she remained silent, her expression inscrutable.
I could see her mind working, trying to decide whether to continue her denial or to admit the smallest of truths. At last, she spoke, her voice quiet. Monsieur Poirot, there are things in this house, things about this family, that no one
speaks of. But if you are looking for the truth, you must understand one thing. Everyone here had a reason to want Gregory dead. Her words were both a warning and an invitation, a shift in the game. I had been circling the truth, but now I
was closer than ever to understanding the full extent of the lies. But what truth was she hinting at? And what was the final secret of the Hadley family that had driven them all to this point? I stood up, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. The investigation had reached its climax, but it was clear that the most dangerous revelations were yet to come.
Chapter 14. The denouement looms. The afternoon had faded into evening by the time I had gathered the remaining members of the Hadley household in the drawing-room. The air was thick with tension, almost palpable in its weight. Each person entered
the room with varying degrees of reluctance, and yet none of them seemed entirely surprised that the investigation was coming to its head. There was a quiet unease in their movements, a shared awareness that something monumental was about to
unfold. I surveyed the room, my gaze lingering on each of the suspects. Mrs. Hadley, pale and silent, sat in a chair by the window.
Her grief had turned into something more calculated, more distant. Her eyes were focused on nothing in particular, her face an unreadable mask. Beside her, Clara, Gregory's personal assistant, was fidgeting with the hem of her dress, her eyes darting nervously from one person to the next. Her discomfort was not lost on me. She was hiding something. Charles Hadley, the late man's brother-in-law, sat with his arms crossed, his posture stiff. He had maintained an air of aloofness throughout the investigation, but tonight there was a tension about him, as though he was bracing for some unspoken revelation. Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, stood near the door, her eyes fixed on the floor, as if too afraid to meet anyone's gaze. Her earlier remark about the family's secrets echoed in my mind, but I knew it was time to hear her out fully. I sat in the armchair at the far end of the room, my fingers steepled together as I observed them all. I had no intention of jumping into the accusations immediately. I would let them speak, let them fidget, and see what their reactions told me. I knew the truth was in this room, somewhere, but it was buried under layers of deceit, lies, and subtle misdirection. "The time has come," I said finally, my voice breaking the heavy silence. "I have gathered you all here because I have certain truths to share, truths about Gregory's death. The question, however, remains, which one of you is the murderer?" There was a collective gasp, the tension in the room immediately escalating. Mrs. Hadley stiffened, her eyes locking on mine in a mixture of surprise and defiance. Clara bit her lip nervously, her eyes flicking between me and the others as though trying to gauge who might break first. Charles remained unmoving, though I could see the muscles in his jaw tighten as if preparing for something to come. Mrs. Winters, for her part, remained unnervingly calm. "I'm sure," I continued, "that you are all wondering how I came to that conclusion. I do not make such a statement lightly." I let the silence hang, allowing the weight of my words to settle in. "But I am certain that one of you in this room took the life of Gregory Hadley." Mrs. Hadley's breath caught, and her hands clenched in her lap. "How dare you!" she spat, her voice trembling with both anger and fear. "This is outrageous! How can you accuse me of such a thing?" I regarded her quietly, letting her words pass over me. "I accuse no one, madam, not yet, but you must admit there is much that does not add up in your behaviour. Your grief, while it appeared genuine at first, has now become something different. A well-rehearsed performance, perhaps?" Her face flushed, and I could see the vein at her temple pulse in the way only a person trying to hide something might. "You have no right to speak of my grief. Gregory was my husband. I loved him." "Yes, yes," I replied, my tone unruffled. "But love is not always so pure, is it? Love can be a powerful motivator, and in this case I have reason to believe it may have driven you to something far darker than mere grief." The room fell into silence again as I turned my gaze to Clara. "And you, mademoiselle," I said. "What of you?" "You were in a position of trust with Mr. Hadley, close to him in a way no one else was. It seems odd to me, however, that your alibi during the crucial moments of his death remains so vague." Clara flinched, her fingers still twisting the fabric of her dress. "I've already told you," she said, her voice shaking. "I was in the office. I was trying to finish some paperwork for Mr. Hadley." "Yes," I replied, my voice soft but pointed. "But that was not the whole story, was it? You see, I've learned that Gregory's last days were filled with fears of betrayal, of being watched, of someone close to him turning against him. He believed that someone in this house wanted him dead, and yet you have been less than forthcoming about your whereabouts that evening." Clara's eyes widened, and she swallowed hard, a tremor in her voice. I didn't know he was in danger. I had no idea what was really going on." "And yet," I pressed, "you were the one who kept insisting on his safety in front of others. Your concern seemed too convenient." Mrs. Winters cleared her throat at that moment, drawing my attention to her. She had not spoken, didn't she? I had entered the room, but I could feel her presence weighing heavily in the background. "Mr. Poirot," she said, her voice low and steady, "I do not understand how you can make such an accusation. We are all grieving here. To point fingers in such a manner is cruel." "Cruel?" I repeated softly. "Perhaps. But sometimes the truth must be delivered with force, Mrs. Winters. You, of all people, should know that sometimes we must do what is necessary, no matter how painful." She did not respond immediately, but there was a glint in her eyes, a flicker of something beneath the surface. It was not guilt, but something else. Could she be hiding something as well? Perhaps she too had a role to play in this twisted scenario. And then there was Charles. I turned my gaze upon him, my eyes narrowing. He had been quiet throughout the conversation, his posture rigid, his expression a mask of calm. But I had noticed a change in him over the past few days, something subtle but unmistakable. He was the one who had been so eager to leave the scene when the police had first arrived, the one who had appeared the least interested in uncovering the truth. There had been something off about his behavior from the beginning, and now, as I looked at him, I could see it clearly. "You, Charles," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. "You were, after all, the one most likely to benefit from Mr. Hadley's death. The inheritance, the control of the estate, everything you wanted was right there for the taking. And yet you have been so quick to defend yourself, so eager."
To protect your reputation. But why, Charles? Why should someone like you be so concerned with your reputation if you had nothing to hide? Charles stiffened at my words, but he did not speak.
Instead, he merely looked at me with cold eyes, as though daring me to press further. The tension in the room was unbearable, and yet I knew that I had only just begun to peel back the layers of this carefully constructed facade. "I see that you are all rather reticent," I said finally, letting the words settle over them like a heavy cloak. "But I have observed you carefully, each of you, and I now know which one of you is the murderer." There was a collective intake of breath, but no one spoke. The room felt suffocatingly still, as though everyone were waiting for the final reveal. "But before I give my answer," I continued, "there is one final detail that you should all know. The clock on the wall ticked, its sound sharp and insistent, and in that silence I made my move." Chapter 15. The Grand Reveal. The room was heavy with anticipation, the tension nearly suffocating. Everyone was now acutely aware that the moment of revelation had arrived. I had carefully studied each person in the room, their expressions, their movements, the subtle shifts in their body language. It was time to pull back the curtain on this carefully constructed mystery, to expose the truth in all its cold, cruel clarity. I leaned forward slightly, my fingers steepled before me, and allowed the silence to settle for just a moment longer, making sure that every single person in that room was hanging on to my every word. "Each of you," I began, my voice calm and measured, "has given me something, a piece of the puzzle, a clue, whether intentional or not. The problem, however, has never been one of missing pieces. It has been the inability to see the whole picture." I looked at Mrs. Hadley first, her face drawn tight in nervous tension. "You," I said, "made the crucial mistake of thinking that your grief would shield you. But it was not grief that guided your actions. It was something else. You needed time to solidify your position in this house, to ensure that no one would question your rights to the inheritance that awaited you." Her breath hitched, and I saw her eyes flicker toward Clara before returning to me. She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up my hand. "No, madame, let me continue," I said, with a slight shake of my head. "You, of course, never expected to be found out, but you did not count on a single detail. Your own emotions betrayed you. The moment you spoke about seeing your husband's ghost, you made an unforgivable mistake." I turned my attention to Clara, whose face had gone
Pale at the mention of the widow's claim.
She met my gaze with a fleeting moment of panic, but quickly masked it with the same practiced composure she had worn since the beginning of this investigation. "Ah, Clara," I continued, "you, of all people, were the one who kept the secret
Of your aunt's sightings under wraps. How very convenient that you allowed the story to spread, didn't you? A ghostly figure, a haunting that with just a little nudge could make the authorities and all who heard the tale think that Gregory had died in some tragic, unnatural way." Clara's lips pressed together tightly, but she did not speak. Her?
Eyes flitted from me to her aunt, as though seeking support, but none came. No, I said softly. The truth is far simpler than that.
You were the one who orchestrated the entire affair, weren't you? Gregory's death was not the result of some tragic accident. No, Clara, Gregory was murdered. And you, my dear, are the one who planned it all. Clara's hands tightened
Into fists at her sides, her chest rose and fell with short, rapid breaths as she swallowed hard, as if grappling with something much darker than I had yet to unravel. She looked at me for a long, drawn-out moment, her face as cold as stone. "You're
wrong," she said quietly, though I could hear the tremor in her voice, despite her best efforts to control it. "You're completely wrong. I wasn't involved in any of this." I didn't flinch at her denial. "Ah, but you were, mademoiselle. You were involved in every step of the process. You were the one who stood to gain the most."
Weren't you? You were the one who resented Gregory's presence in your life, who grew tired of waiting for him to finally leave the estate to you. The inheritance was meant for him, not you, but you knew, didn't you, that if Gregory were gone, the money, the power, all of it would be yours. Clara's eyes flashed with something akin to fury, but she remained silent, her jaw clenching.
"Tight. It was you," I said, my voice now rising with certainty. "You took advantage of the situation, manipulated the circumstances to make it seem as though Gregory's death had been something else, and you knew exactly what you were."
Doing when you allowed the story of his ghost to spread. You knew that your aunt would be an unwitting accomplice in your plan. The room was still, no one moving, no one speaking. Mrs. Hadley, pale and shaken, turned her gaze toward Clara, as if seeing her niece for the first time. The realization of her involvement seemed to be sinking in, but Clara remained eerily composed. "You," I said to her, "were the one who made sure that Gregory's body was found after you had already taken his life."
You knew that the only way to avoid suspicion was to make it look as though his death had been some tragic accident. But you weren't content with simply ending his life. No, you had to manipulate everything. You had to make it look as though
Gregory had returned from the dead, didn't you? Clara's lips curled into a tight, forced smile, though there was no warmth in it. She took a long, deep breath before her cold, calculating voice filled the room. "Yes," she said, her words coming with cold precision. "I did. But it wasn't just for the inheritance. It was for something much more important. I've been waiting my entire life for this, you see. I've been waiting for the moment when I could finally take control. Gregory had no right to keep everything
from me, and I knew that if I didn't act, I would be stuck in this miserable position for the rest of my life." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "It wasn't just about the money. It was about power. It was about having the life that should have been mine all along. And Gregory, he was standing in my way."
There was a cold, eerie finality to her confession, a sense of satisfaction in her voice, as though she had been waiting to say these words all along. Her eyes remained locked on mine, as though daring me to challenge her, to question her. "You're not wrong," she continued, "about how I staged it. It was a careful game. I made sure that the servants saw me leave the study late that night. Then I went to the garden, retrieved the cigarette that Gregory had carelessly discarded, and planted it in the study, making it look like he had been there recently. I knew that the police would jump to conclusions, that they would think the ghost story had merit. It was perfect." I regarded her with a mixture of admiration and revulsion. The lengths she had gone to were extraordinary.
Cold, calculated, and utterly devoid of any remorse. "So there you have it. I said, turning to face the others in the room. Clara, the murderer, the one who pulled the strings behind it all, she manipulated the circumstances, played the role of a grieving niece, and turned the tragedy of Gregory's death into something far more sinister.
The room was utterly silent, save for Clara's soft, controlled breathing. The truth was out now, and there was no escaping it. I stood, my gaze never leaving Clara's face. "It is always order and method that prevails, Hastings," I said, softly, turning to my friend, who had been standing quietly to the side. "And it is through the little grey cells that we find the answers." As Clara's face hardened into a mask of fury, I knew this was not over, not yet. But for now, the truth had been revealed.